Welcome again. This is our second day of our community spiritual retreat, Winter Renewal Week, diving deeper into God. And, you know, the music this morning was especially beautiful. As I was listening, I was remembering that prayer by Master, I believe it's in Whispers from Eternity, where he says, I won't offer you the premeditated hothouse flowers, but only the spontaneous expressions of my own soul's devotion. And that's just what it felt like. It just felt a bunch of people who love God and when they open their mouths, that devotion just comes right out without having to work at it. Well, what our topic is today is seeing God as the doer. And as we introduced yesterday, we had been with Swamiji and said, kind of blurted out, Swami, how do you become a Jivan Mukta? And he just looked at us and he said, oh, it's really quite easy. You have to get rid of the ego. And that's done by deeper, longer meditation and seeing God as the doer. And so yesterday we talked about deeper, longer meditation and also the right attitudes that help us to become disentangled from the meshes of Maya that keep our minds engaged. And so today we're going to talk about seeing God as the doer. And this is actually not an easy subject. Often people come to me and they say, I hear all the time, you know, we should see God as the doer, but what does that really mean? And it's not an easy concept, and I'm not sure I understand. But we'll share this morning with you whatever little wisdom we've gleaned and inspiration from other sources. And I'd like to start with a story, very interesting, true story. Took place in 1528. And it's recorded in the archives of the Kingdom of Spain. And it was known as the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. And he was a Spanish soldier of fortune. And with 4 great Spanish galleons and 400 men and 80 horses, they took off in their beautiful Spanish armor. They took off from Spain for the New World. And mainly their intention was greed and ambition. They want to conquer territory, find gold, maybe as a sideline convert some of the heathens to Christianity, but that was certainly a sideline. And so this proud force of Spanish galleons crossed the ocean, but as they approached the New World, they were beset by a terrible tornado. And the tornado, I guess it's hurricane in the ocean, tornado inland, a terrible hurricane. And the hurricane knocked their boats about, and they lost half of their ships and half of their men. They went down in the storm. And finally, they limped, if ships limp, into Florida, and they were exhausted and disheartened because of what they had experienced. And they disembarked. But the captain was a man of great greed, and he said, I will burn these ships. There's no turning back. So he burnt the 2 remaining ships, took everything on land. And these men, already exhausted from their labors in full armor, he forced them on a march to try to discover, as soon as they could, what riches could be found in the New World. And so they began to see some Indians who came out of friendliness and curiosity to observe them. And they immediately took them captive and said, take us to your cities. They expected these great cities of gold. And so they very willingly and happily took them to their nearby village, which was mud huts and dirt and a few livestock and dire poverty. And the men thought, the Spanish leaders thought, oh, they're hiding it from us. And they treated the Indians cruelly. And little by little, the Indians began realizing these men are not our friends. And whereas first they had fed them, in the middle of the night, they just disappeared and went back into the natural landscape. And so these men, by now disease had ravaged them, and what had been 200 was now 100. And their horses, they began eating their horses because they were starving. And finally, they made it back to the shore where their boats were burned. There was no way to get back. And by this time, they had cast off their armor. They were in rags. They were starving. And by this time, there was just a handful left. And so stripped of humanity were they that in their dire straits, they began to practice cannibalism. And they were eating the dead soldiers just to survive. And by this time, there were 4 of them left, 4 remaining of the 400 that have set off from Spain. And the Indians by this time began circling around, and they saw that there were only 4 left. And they saw what a horrible condition they were, living like animals, filled with disease and no clothes and no shelter. And these Indians, who they had thought perhaps they would convert to Christianity, treated them with kindness and took them in and fed them and nurtured them and received them warmly. But then the winter began to come on, and the Indians' food supply began to run out. And they said to them, because the Indians didn't understand who these men were, they thought perhaps because they'd come on these mighty ships that they were children of the sun. That's what they thought they were. And so they said, the Indians came to them and said, you must, if we are to feed you, our food is running out, you must heal our sick. Well, these men were mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, come for greed. They had no special power. The only redeeming factor perhaps is that they grew up in a Catholic country. And so they brought them their ill, and they had watched the Indian medicine man, how they healed people, and they would blow on them. So out of starvation, they said, we will do this. They had no expectation. So they brought the ill before them, and they blew on them, made the sign of the cross, repeated Ave Maria, prayed in the name of Christ that they would be healed. And lo and behold, they were healed. And the men were amazed. How could this be? There they were, the lowest of the low, having been stripped of everything. And then the band of Indians they were with, because they were moving towards warmer climate, began to travel across the country. And the reputation of these children of the sun began to spread. And other tribes would come, and they would bring their ill to them. And every time when they would pray in the name of Christ, these people would be healed. Finally, they came to a tribe, and there was much wailing and lamentation. And they brought them in, and the chief of the tribe had died. And they said, you must bring him back to life. Soldiers of fortune, living like animals. All that was left was the thought that God could heal this man. Christ brought people back from the dead. Christ could bring this chief back from the dead. They went, blew on his body, prayed, made the sign of the cross, left the little hut where the chief was, and then there was a great cry, and lo and behold, the chief had been raised from the dead. And they began a journey which lasted 8 years, from Florida across the coast, the country of America, and all along the way, they performed miracles. And as they began approaching the West Coast, there were traveling with them from 3,000 to 4,000 people. And somehow they would be fed, and somehow they would be healed. And then as they asked the Indians, are there other people like us? And they said, oh yes, if we continue in this way, but they are not good men. They have taken us captive and made us slaves, so we will not take you. We will show you where they are, but we will not take you there. And so they pointed them in the direction of Mexico City, where there was a Spanish colony. And after 8 years of living in this way, they saw the first white man. And he was dressed in finery, and he was full of the ambition and greed that brought the Spanish and the other colonists to the New World. And they shrank back. And they said, these men, Spanish, they are supposed to be the Christians, but all we see are Indian slaves and greed and full of their own ambition. And these people we have been living with, they're the poor, selfless children of God who are the true Christians. And they had a very hard time reintegrating into putting shoes on. They couldn't stand to put shoes on at first and wearing the confining garments. But this man, Cabeza de Vaca, wrote this narrative to the King of Spain. He said, by the power of Christ, these miracles have happened. And when we come to conquer a country, we must understand that if we don't bring love and the Spirit of Christ, we are nothing. We are animals. We are worse than animals because the things we have done. And this paper still exists. This is a true story. And so what can we learn from that? The spirit of absolute throwing away, if we want to feel God coming through us in perhaps even miraculous ways, every part that is our own self-definition. As Swamiji has said repeatedly recently, the ego is just a bundle of self-definitions. All of that we think is important or valuable or worthy of attention or praise from others, we have to let it all go. We have to be nothing. We have to be at that point where all that is of importance within us is the power of God to flow through us, and only then He can. Recently, Narani, I don't see her here, she's probably teaching school, but she was telling me about a beautiful book which she lent me. And it takes us to the next step, the stories from this book in seeing God as the doer. This is called, it's Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light, the private writings of the Saint of Calcutta. And these are letters that Mother Teresa wrote to her confessor and her superior for decades. And her life was fascinating. We know very little of who she really was. We know of her work in the slums with the poor and the dying and diseased in Calcutta. But she was a soul of incredible spiritual depth. When she became a nun as a young woman, she was from Albania, and asked to be a missionary when she was 18 years old and was sent to India. But they were doing just sort of typical missionary work, having schools and that sort of thing, nothing like the mission that she found later. But when she had a deep and intimate relationship with Christ, and her love for Christ was so powerful and consuming. She made a vow, when she took her final vow as a nun, she said, God, I give you everything you ask, I will say yes, no matter how hard, no matter how much I resist it, everything, I will say yes. And then around 1945, 1946, she began getting her second call, which was to work with the poorest of the poor in the slums of Calcutta. But prior to that, about that same time, I should say, she had a series for about a year, a series of experiences of Christ's presence, visions of Him appearing before her, being in deep states of ecstasy, being uplifted and transported in ways she had never been. But the interesting thing is that I found so moving was when she started her work with the poorest of the poor, it all was gone. And for the next 50 years, she felt nothing of the presence of God. She said, if I ever am to become a saint, I will be the saint of darkness, because it is only from darkness that I am able to help others into the light. Extraordinary. It makes her life so much more meaningful. But she wrote these letters talking about her experiences to her superior. And at the end, towards the end of her life, she begged them, please burn these letters. I don't want anybody to know of what my life has been about, because then people will think of me, and I don't want them to think of me. I only want them to think of Christ. And I just want to read one brief letter that captures the spirit of this. Your Grace, now that you are looking through the file of our society, I beg you to destroy any letter that I have written to Your Grace, not connected with the society. That means the business. The call was a delicate gift of God to me, unworthy. I do not know why He picked me up. I suppose like the people we pick up, because they are the most unwanted. From the first day to this my new vocation has been one prolonged yes to God, without even a look at the cost. My conviction that this is His work is more than the reality. I have never doubted. It hurts me only when people call me foundress, because I know for certain He asked, will you do this for me? Everything was His. I had only to surrender myself to His plan, to His will. Today His work has grown because it is He, not I, that does it through me. Of this I am so convinced I would give my life gladly to prove it. Well, they didn't destroy the letters, and the letters are recorded in this book. But the point here for how to feel God as the doer is, we told the story of the Spanish soldiers of fortune where they were stripped of all identity. Then the next step is everything that we do, even if it's of value, of worth, don't take it unto yourself. We don't have to say, I did this, I did that. But to always say, it's God who did it. It's God who did it. And the great ones modeled this for us. When people would say to Yogananda, oh, I understand Dr. Lewis was your first disciple in America. He would never accept that people were his disciples. He would say, that's what they say. And when people would touch his feet, he would just point to God, as though I accept your devotion only because I offer it to God. And so if we can live in this spirit, and in this community we do, but just watch the subtle little things. Someone praises you for something. You did this well. You did, just to say no. That's when they said to Christ, my good man. He said, why call you me good? There is only one good, and He is our Father who art in heaven. And so if we can, by doing this, we become identified, not with whatever little talents or abilities we have. And it's interesting. The things that we are the most secure in are usually the things that are the least important to us. It's the things that we're kind of working on. Can I really do this? I've struggled with trying to be an athlete all my life, but I think I was the only girl in junior high school who never made a basket in basketball. But there are things I'm secure in. And so I don't care if people notice them or not. There are things like running. Oh, I ran 8 miles, or I did a marathon, and I know I brag about it because it's not something that I feel is mine, that I'm secure in that. So just everything that any gift or grace we have, and there are many in this room who have many gifts and graces. And looking out at all of these faces, there are healers, and there are artists, and there are artistic people, and there are people with trained and clever minds, and there are people who understand how to build community and how to do gardens and so many different things. But if we can just, as we develop, and we talked a little bit yesterday about the beauty of living in community, because we're all playing different parts on behalf of each other. Some of us have raised children, and we do that on behalf of each other. Some of us have done brilliant writing, and we do that on behalf of each other. But as a community, if we can always look at each other and say, I see God flowing through you when you do that. Not you did a good job, because that locks us in our ego. But I see God coming through you so beautifully. And then we can all rejoice together in how God has blessed our lives. Not us, but Him coming through us. And the more we do that, the more this community becomes a divine place. Earlier this winter, I was going out. We live by the beautiful museum and Crystal Hermitage Boutique. And there was a woman coming up the stairs from the chapel, and she was on crutches. And it was like a day like today. It was icy and slippery. And I said, oh, it must not be easy to get around here. She was a visitor on crutches. And she said, yes, I have a badly broken ankle. But the doctors weren't sure it would heal properly. And I knew I had to come to Ananda, because I knew if I came here, it would heal properly. And I was it was a very moving moment for me that people can draw that. But we need to remember, however holy, however spiritually powerful this community becomes, and I believe it will. I think we haven't even begun to understand what is happening here through the lives of so many people, so sincerely giving their life to God. Whatever becomes, however high we come, we should always remember, always, God made this beautiful community. I remember the very first day, 4th of July, 1969, I set foot on this property. There was nothing, just mud and dirt and a couple of old rickety fences and a broken down farmhouse, which we've kept alive as Master's Market. But I set foot on this property and I thought, there's something special here, before we even took possession of it. And it was the power of God and Guru coming to say, make this place for God. If you try, I will help you. Just get out of the way. Just as Mother Teresa also described herself, she said, I am just a pencil in God's hands. We are just pitchforks or backhoes or computers or chopping knives in God's hands. That's all we are. And the more we can enjoy our life together in this way, the deeper we will go in feeling God's presence in our lives. Another beautiful story, so to kind of pick up where we've been going, to strip away everything of external identity, to not claim any gifts or graces that we may have. And then another example for us, and maybe the next stage in how we can go deeper into feeling God as the doer, comes from the life of the wonderful Christian missionary Frank Laubach. And some of you know his story, some of you don't. He wrote a little book called Letters of a Modern Mystic, which is a compilation of his letters. He was a missionary sent to the Philippines. And when he was sent to a very remote part of the island, and there weren't many people to be converted, and they weren't very interested in what he was doing. So he had a lot of time on his hands. And he thought, I will try a little experiment. I have all this time. There isn't a lot of work to do with the people. I will try for 5 minutes each day to think only of God. And then I will keep building it and building it and building it. And he tells, through his letters, he tells the story of his transformation. And by the end of this time, several months, he was thinking of God, not 5 minutes, not 10 minutes, not an hour, but every waking moment, he was thinking of God. And he began to experience, just as we've been talking about, God flowing through him. He said, I feel God moving through my fingers as they type these letters. This is something we can all do. I mean, for all of us who work at computers or answer letters, how much time we sit there and push buttons and, oh God, I got to answer this one, But if we can feel, no, God's energy is moving through me as I do this. And Swamiji gave us, not this last visit, but the visit before, he gave us the instruction, and it's well worth repeating at this point because I know I surely have forgotten it. I surely haven't been trying to practice. But he told us to do just what Frank Laubach suggested. He said, try for 5 minutes every day just to think of God. And that doesn't mean while you're meditating. It means when you're going about your business, just to think of God for 5 minutes. And then you'll know when to increase it. And as the more we can do it, he said, there'll come to the time will come where it's painful to have your mind anywhere else. And so there are two, when people ask, how do I feel? How do I understand what it means that God is the doer? There are 2 aspects to it. The first, and we've primarily been talking about this one, is to try to feel his, and try to unite your consciousness with him, and then to try to feel that everything you do, you are an instrument for him. And when you make mistakes, give those mistakes to God. If you do something well, say, God, you did that one good. Boy, you blew that one. But because in truth, that is the reality. Our successes, our failures, our poor health, our good health, none of it is ours. It's God coming to us. So to feel God in all that we're doing, and then the second aspect is to feel God in everything that is done to us, everything that comes to us, all the events in our life. Even, as Jyotish mentioned, when we were driving over, just as we were coming down the hill from Ayodhya, there was a beautiful little red fox just sitting there looking at us. And I felt it so much, because the foxes have such a magic quality. I felt it so much that it was God saying, go on, have lots of energy, have lots of fun. But if we can feel God talking to us in everything that happens, in a child having a tantrum, what is God trying to tell us here? In a parent that is ill and in the last throes of illness, what is God telling us? In people that are unkind and insensitive, people that are trying to get our goat, all of these things, just to see, God, I see you in all. There's a lovely story of true story of a young Indian boy of about 6 or 7 who was a disciple of Satya Sai Baba in India. And he lived in Sai Baba's ashram and was just like one of Baba's children. Satya Sai Baba is a great saint of India. And he Sai Baba said, why don't you go for the weekend and you can visit your mother and father, your brothers and sisters, and play with the children in the village. I think you would enjoy this. So the little boy kind of reluctantly, he didn't want to leave his guru, but he went back to the village. And he spent the weekend there, and just as Sai Baba had suggested, visited with his mother and father, played with his brother and sisters and his playmates in the village. And then after a few days, he came back. And Sai Baba asked him, well, did you see your mother and father? And the little boy looked down rather embarrassed, and he said, no, Baba, I only saw you. And he said, well, did you play with your brothers and sisters? And he said, no, Baba, I just played with you. And he said, well, did you go out in the village and see the other children? He said, no, Baba, please stop teasing me. You know that you are all that I see. And if we can live in that way, that every friend, every enemy, every stranger, every brother or sister, we only see God there, then we can begin to understand and live in the deep spirit that God is the doer. And I just want to close with this beautiful prayer from Metaphysical Meditations by Master. Beloved Lord, teach me to feel that Thou art the sole activating power, and that in recognition of Thee as the doer lies the value of all my life's experiences. I'll read it again. Beloved Lord, Teach me to feel that thou art the sole activating power, and that in recognition of thee as the doer lies the value of all my life's experiences. So we begin to understand why Swamiji said to become a saint, we need to see God as the doer, because it puts the whole context of all of our life's experiences, everything we do, everything that we want, everything that we identify with, everything that happens to us, in the context that God is the sole activating power. And bit by bit, we make the transition from feeling ourselves separate from God to feeling ourselves one with God, to finally feeling only God.